If you're listening, you were like, "Come on, get to the tea." Well, here we go. I will tell you, listener viewers, there was some discussion. Do we really want to cover this? Because it's a bit, it's a lot. But of
Delicious,
course,
right?
we've already been talking about it. The rippling deal drama, right? If we're going to be called spilling the tea, then we got to talk tea, right? Got to talk drama. So the newest, if you haven't been keeping up, bless you. Also, the newest one is that Rippling wants Revolut, who's a payments fintech company out of the UK, they want them to kind of give them the info on who was paying the alleged spy within Rippling. If you recall, what's going down lately between the two of them is that there's been an allegation from Rippling that Deal had engaged in corporate espionage by having a spy who was leaking information back to Deal.
Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Spilling the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. We break down the news of the week and help you make sense of what it means for our industry and how it can impact your organization. We're recording today on April 28th, 2025, bringing you all the news you can use this week. It's really getting it closer to summer already. I'm your host, Stacey Harris, Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner for Sapient Insights Group, a research and advisory firm. And joining me today, as usual, in the conversation is our co-host, Cliff Stevenson, Director of Research and Principal Analyst for Sapient Insights Group. Cliff, welcome to the show. You're joining from home, but I'm joining from my family's house out in Hawaii. Sounds beautiful, but my son works out here for the Air Force and I get to see my granddaughter. I've got a weekend in between trips out on the West Coast. I get to come see them. So what fun I'm having today, but the audience might hear some roosters crowing outside, birds twittering. I got a couple of puppy dogs in the office with me like you do normally, Cliff. So we're going to keep going as much as we can today.
I was really hoping your background was going to be like one of the fake ones people put on, that from Hawaii, but yours would be real. For those of you that watch us on YouTube, you'll be like, "Wait, that's Hawaii. I want to see the mountains and stuff." But it's not all like that, I think.
Yeah, no. My son lives in a beautiful little place in Eva Beach, but it is just a collection of houses, and behind me some nice trees, but the light comes in too much. So we're doing good here, but I'm excited because it's a big week, and I just got off of the Workday Innovation Summit, so we'll have a little bit of update from there. We're getting ready to head out to Oracle's innovation event and their analyst relations summit. So we're busy with travels. I think you were planning on going a few places this weekend, next week, and we got several upcoming events. But it's a crazy kind of week, Cliff. You said there's almost 20 stories today, right?
Yes, at least. Yeah. We don't want anyone to get scalded, but this tea is coming straight from the boiler. You'll probably, if you're paying attention, you'll note that we usually record this about a week prior to when you're hearing it, but now it's only going to be a few days before you hear it. So this is the hottest of tea, but because of all the travel and time zones, and plus just it gives opportunity to talk about some news that's happening right now. Stacey was I think I had to do the math on it because the time zone is probably about 5 a.m. her time and sending me stories to talk about. So it's not truly a vacation, or maybe nothing's a vacation if you love your work.
That's right. When you get up at 3 a.m. and you can't really go out into the hallway because you don't want to wake up the baby, what do? You sit and you flip through your phone and you look at all the stories. So yeah, we have a couple extra stories this week, guys. Sorry.
But a lot of events we're going to be at, as you mentioned. I'll be traveling again. As you just came from Workday, and you'll probably give us some stories from that. And then you're just going straight from Hawaii to California, right, for Oracle?
Yes, I'll be at the Oracle Analyst Summit out in Redwood, California. So if you have any questions on that, let us know. And then you and I would both be at the iSolve People Connect event. And I'll be at the iSolve People Connect in May in Charlotte, 6th or 7th. That's a regional one. And then we'll both be at Unleash, right, Cliff?
That's right. I'll be in Unleash May 6th through 8th. And then I'll be there the 6th and 7th, and you'll be there the 7th and 8th.
And I'll be doing a session on the 8th on demystifying the AI environment. And we'll be talking with HPE about their AI investments and how they're basically taking what is a really strategic approach to AI within their organization and how they're creating an environment where AI is part of what the company is doing. And I think that's really powerful from an HR perspective and a whole company perspective. We'll be doing that in conjunction with Workday out there. And then you'll be at WorkHumans May 12th, 13th. You and Susan Richards are our founder, right?
That's right. And in fact, that's another one, kind of like how we're doing Unleash. We're going to both be there with some overlap. I'll be there that Monday, Tuesday with something on Wednesday. And Susan will also be there, as you mentioned, on the Wednesday and Thursday, 13th and 14th.
And then Terry Zipper, who's our CEO, will be speaking at Total Rewards event in Orlando, Florida, out in your neck of the woods, Cliff, on May 19th and 21st. She'll be doing a really great session on compensation and what's going on in that market. So definitely look Terry up if you get a chance to be there. And then both you and I will be also in Florida. It seems like Florida is the place to be this spring at the UKG analyst event in Fort Lauderdale, May 22nd. Now that's another analyst only event, which means we'll be bringing you all the little tea behind the scenes about what they're doing. And I'm excited to see what UKG is doing. I think, I always like these analyst events when they're early in spring because we get to hear what's coming, where a lot of times when we have them in the fall, they end up being very much more about what they've done over the year. So lots of exciting new stuff. I'm excited to see where they're at with UKG. And then you and I will both be at Cornerstone Spark event May 27th and 29th in Las Vegas. I'll be speaking at the executive track, and Cliff, you'll be attending and talking to some of their customers. I always like Cornerstone's event. Their customers are always great conversations. And then you and I will both be at iSolve Partner Connect. Oh, no, you'll be at the iSolve Partner Connect. And then in 16th and 18th, that's the sales kickoff in Las Vegas, Cliff. So you'll be kind of back to back in Las Vegas, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that the Florida trips, which are nicer for me, are over, and it's back to the Vegas grind. But it's not so much of a grind when it's with iSolved. And yes, I'll be speaking and doing a panel there for their Partner Connect and for the sales kickoff in Vegas. And then we'll both be in Vegas for HR Tech, the earliest it's ever been, as far as I know, September 15th through the 18th. Or so. I know we have begun planning for it. If you are one of the partners, I believe or one of the vendors who's going to be there, I believe they're going to start scheduling in this coming week.
I'm barely getting Unleashed scheduled at this point, let alone, HR Tech this fall. It's getting around all the scheduling has been a bit of a challenge. We're trying to figure this out because now that we're on Zoom scheduling, it's a little bit not quite as seamless, but we're making it work, right? Like getting all those things together. But yeah, there's a lot of events, and somewhere in between there, Susan, Terry, and I will also be doing the Women We Bank, which is a women business enterprise association organization, and that's going to be fun because we'll be talking to a lot of associations about the work that we do and the work that they do, and speaking at that event. And I know we have several webinars coming up and several events coming up in June and July. We'll probably have more on that in the next so it's just a busy week, lots and lots of stuff going on in the next couple of months, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, with HR Tech is when we'll be debuting the 28th annual HR Systems Survey data results. And all of that will be available. But that data is only possible because of input from you, the listener or viewer, however you might be doing it. And that survey is live if you are working with one of the great distributors that we have, but it's completely open to the public just about the time you're hearing this, either that day or the day before, May 1st, it'll be available. So if you've been dying to take it, as I know you have, it's going to be there. We've done everything we can to do two things that they're not at odds, but it sound like they are, right? We've made it more extensive, more comprehensive, covering all sorts of different areas, really getting into a lot of the business side, talking about big business initiatives and how that's affected by all this new tech, including a lot of AI. We're going to be talking about contingent workforce management, always a hot topic when there is a volatile economy, which is a nice way of saying it.
We'll be one of the few that have a user experience and vendor sat on your contingent workforce management tools this year. So watch that carefully. Yes.
Exactly. But at the same time, we've taken all that comprehensiveness and we've actually streamlined it, meaning we let you just figure out what is your area of expertise, where do you want your voice to be heard, and we make it as easy and painless as possible. So all the good stuff happens. You get to see the impact of your opinions. It's not one of those, just click here and no one's looking at it. I can guarantee you when we're going to these events that Stacey and I are talking about, the highest levels of these organizations are seeing what you have to say about their products and making changes based on that. So it's really nice. It's a win-win.
Yeah, we were really excited. Even this first 2 weeks that we've been open, I think we're around 400 organizations who have already submitted data. Now, if you're one of the people who really like the incentives, be aware that those incentives get spread out across all over the 6,000 plus people who generally participate. But it was good for us to see that in this first couple of weeks that the interest is high. I think, and you and I have talked about this, Cliff, that people are right now, the world feels a little bit unsure and untested. You're not sure what steps you're going to be taking. And I think one way to get your arms wrapped around it is to be part of something where you get some data back. And so that's a lot of what we're seeing, I think, in the survey this year. Because we're not just asking about AI, but we're also asking about all the other application areas that you're kind of having to fit in and around these conversations. And it's as an HR leader and HR professional, there is so much coming at you all at once right now. So we're hoping that with a little bit of investment in participating in the survey, you'll get a lot back by getting not only the full responses back, which is a really powerful tool for a lot of organizations like to track what they're doing every year. But I know, Cliff, we're also doing this year, they get their mini benchmark. They get to be part of some early findings data sets. And there's some new stuff where you're working on this year, I think, where they get visualizations around their environments if they're interested in it, right?
Yeah, it's because we've seen this over time. People have more and more systems than they ever did, and we're going to be talking a lot today about more sort of blending of work or productivity tech versus HR tech. It's getting really hard to tell. So having that ability to see a visual blueprint of how all your systems are and to see, oh, we don't really have much in terms of talent that I thought we did, or wow, we have 20 payroll systems I didn't realize. And you start to think, which of these makes sense, especially as Stacey, something you've really been talking a lot about is this idea of clustering, right? Yeah. Figure out what are your core systems and who are going to play nice. Because another story we're going to talk about is how some HR vendors are not playing nice, but you'll have to stay tuned to see when we talk about that. I think we could, well, why don't we talk a little bit about Workday? Or is that's where you're at? And then
that's where I was at last week. I'll give a little bit of update on the Workday Innovation Summit. I did a nice post on it, so I would recommend it. Maybe we'll link that in the notes on the post. That what's nice about what we saw this week in Workday is they've had a lot of leadership changes, particularly in the product area and in some of the marketing and other areas. And what we're hearing really clearly from Carl Esteban and the two new presidents, Garrett and Rob, is that they're all on the same page. And there's a couple of key themes that were coming out on the same page. One is they're heavily focused on execution and speed. And that's really important in this day and age, as long as we're keeping quality up. And you do hear them continuously talk about that we have to do this in the right way, that we have to make sure that the customers are part of the center of that conversation, that the market's moving fast. There's definitely that AI is at the center of the conversation. You've heard them also talk a lot about their agentic AI platform and their workforce record and agentic workforce record. That's going to be a really big push for them this year and next year. And then I think is probably one of the most powerful conversations, because as I mentioned in my notes, it's really easy to talk about AI and agents and how and we're going to have a lot of conversation about this later on in the show, about how they're replacing work to some extent. But what we know in our research and what we know from watching things happen in the market is that when you enable your workforce and you use agentic AI to support and give them more time and give them more ability to do more strategic work, you get the best out of both worlds. When you think about agents as replacing people, that doesn't go over very well. And definitely that's not the direction we're hearing Workday go, but we're hearing a lot of other vendors kind of push in that direction. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're definitely hearing them really think seriously about change management with AI. Allie Fuller, who is their head of experience and of their overall platform experience, really has focused heavily on making sure that, we're not just popping AI up, but we're popping up the places where AI is inputting information. So you as the human being, the employee and the manager and the executive can double check the work, make sure that it's accurate, and then submit before it happens, so that it's not just kind of doing it behind the scenes and in that black box, which is one of the biggest and most concerning things about the market, especially from a regulatory perspective. The other thing that they really emphasized a lot this year was their focus on creating a Workday ecosystem. Now, for many of you who have been in the enterprise application space, companies who are over 5 and 10,000 employees, or even if you're in a mid-market space and you've worked with one of the larger vendors like SAP or Oracle for years, many people had a partner environment driven by system integrators, and system integrators are amazing people. I The work that we do here at Sapient Insights Group that's based off of our research came out of a great system integrator, Sierra Cedar, back in the day. And so I loved working for Sierra Cedar, and I thought they had a really good perspective on thought leadership and how they help organizations get the most out of the systems. But there was a bit of a challenge in that system integrator model in that the financials that you made from system integration and oftentimes implementation, which was the bigger part of that, was really about keeping people on site, getting people involved, getting those implementations done. And so we oftentimes saw elongated implementations, and that was really kind of a tough place sometimes to be for the buyer, knowing sort of how to balance that implementation and system integrator partnership role with your vendor and what they were offering and what they were trying to do. What I'm seeing Workday do is take a much more cohesive and holistic approach to their partner model. And that includes particularly in bringing those big system integrators, but also bringing those other partners, such as tech providers or service providers like Insperity, into the fold and leveraging them where they make the most sense for the buyers, which I'm always really excited about, because you and I know that technology, when it comes to the biggest thing we hear in our user experience and vendor satisfaction ratings oftentimes is I just didn't get trained enough, or it didn't fill the gap I needed, or there wasn't enough of a connection between what was implemented and what that I said I was going to get. So I think they're really thinking about how do these partners fit the gaps or the issues where the technology needs a human being to help me understand how to leverage it, or services to make the most out of it. They're also really investing heavily in their Extend platform. And for many of those who remember the day when it was the idea of Workday was the single platform, they're now going on the conversation of the power of three. One of those power of threes is the Extend platform. And that power conversation is about how we can provide a safe platform for you to not only build extended application areas, like maybe a separate form you need or a new application you need, for both the partners and the buyers. So that's practitioners who are building out on that, as well as buyers, but also for AI, safe places to build out and practice your AI environments for your organization. So I was really excited to see all the things that they were investing in, the conversations they were having. On the HR side specifically, I think the most important thing that everyone really wants to pay attention to, that I was kind of blown away by, one, I did not know that they had created, and this has been out for about 2 years, so this is me not catching it. And I think, Cliff, that you and I have talked a lot about this, is they have a solution now built in with some of their AI capabilities that is meant to help the employee and the admin walk through the application, kind of a replacement of a WalkMe or a Hendo, one of those kind of applications. And that was highlighted pretty extensively in this with the AI component with it. We definitely saw a lot of investment in the new things for the administrative role, a lot of tools and nudges and for bringing up conversations and content that would help the administrator know about the things maybe they were missing in the application, things they hadn't turned on. I love there's a new dashboard that's going to be showing adoption tracking and information about which areas, kind of built on their AI dashboard that shows which AI has been turned on and off. It's now going to be showing some other things about the application, which I think, again, for an admin, it's going to show them which applications might have bigger benefits if they took the time to invest in them and turn them on and get them rolled out to the organization appropriately. Those are really important. We heard a lot about the job architecture hub, which is already out there, but more investments will be going into that. And I think you probably should be watching that carefully. We also heard a little bit of conversation about end-to-end learning transformation. I think that's just something to watch. There's some of that was under NDA about what the elements of it were, but I think it's really important to watch that. I think Workday is going to be investing more in learning, which is an area you and I are going to be talking a lot about. We also heard some more investments in succession management, which I know is an area that is not had a lot of attention. Even in our research and data, less than 30% of organizations have really invested heavily in a succession management solution. So there was a lot. I could probably spend another hour talking through the big takeaways. But for me, I think the most important thing is that we saw that the leadership is very focused on creating that big ecosystem where partners, service providers, and the customers and Workday are all working hand in hand together, and that we are not seeing them take their foot off the pedal when it comes to HR, but they are being very careful and focusing on the practical things that HR needs to address. Headed up by Ashna, they had a GM in that area. And then more importantly, I think the bigger thing is that I was really blown away with that they are also investing heavily in global in making sure that everything they're doing is tailored towards a market that is planning to be international. In fact, they basically said that only about 25% of their current revenue comes from the global market or international companies, and they plan to expand that to about 50% in the
Oh,
next year
wow.
or two. So that was pretty powerful. So, they're really, I think, turning that corner from being just an application provider to being an ecosystem and a full ERP that the market is investing heavily in. They are spending a lot of investment in their finance space. There's not enough time to cover all that. But one of the things I would watch is the acquisition of their new document management tool, particularly the one that is reading documents. They did it for legal documentation, but it is now being leveraged across HR so that it can read contracts and give you details about contracts. And we all know one of the biggest challenges that we have in HR is we have so much documentation, and getting it read, summarized, and getting that data put into something else has been one of the big problems. I think that Workday is just making some really smart moves in this space around the kind of companies they're acquiring and the focus they're making. Now, my one cautionary tale, and then we can move on to something else, but is as the buyer, as the Workday customer, make sure you stay connected to your Workday counterparts. There's a lot of changing roles in there. Make sure you know what their roadmap is and how that fits with your roadmap. Make sure that if you are someone who is looking at the whole suite, that you understand your industry, and are your industries one of the industries that they're focusing heavily on? And what does that mean for that? How do you become a beta tester? How do you become someone who is involved in the conversation? Because I do think they'll be moving fast. And if you don't move fast with them, you could very quickly lose some of the opportunities that you have to get ahead of the curve. And that, I think, is a bit of a cautionary tale, is that because they're moving so fast, if you're one of the organizations who don't turn on your various modules, or you kind of wait for 3 or 4 or 5 revisions for things, it will be harder to catch up in an environment like this. So a lot of things going on, Cliff. I know it's a little bit long-winded, but I
No.
could probably talk for another hour on it, right?
And as Stacey mentioned, we'll have the link to that, whether that's on LinkedIn or YouTube, however you find out about this. Though that link will be in the notes, so you can go into more detail. But yeah, no, that's amazing. And some of that's news to me too, so I'm getting to enjoy especially the global expansion. That's pretty wild. So as we mentioned, some organizations not getting along, but some are getting along very well. A marriage of sorts. Paychex, which we have announced before on the show about their acquisition of Paycor, that is truly has happened. I think we were careful with our language last time, saying it's in the works or pending final approval. That's all gone through, so that is completed. If you go to Paycor's site now, any of their branding says Paycor, a Paychex company. They did a briefing for press and analysts that I attended. They mentioned that they're going to continue going to market under the Paycor brand. It'll just have that, a Paychex company underneath. They'll keep selling it that way. They're not going to do any forced migrations, at least nothing in the future, as far who knows, but nothing that they've announced, nothing, they don't really see it. One area I was pretty intrigued by was that Paychex, has an ASO and PO capabilities, and Paycor did not. And they see that as a big area of opportunity for them. So I asked them how that would sort of work. If Paycor customers, I know they're not going to do any forced migration, but if they had a PO or if there's something there, but they found that most of the customers, because they're slightly larger in size, most Paycor customers, really there is some opportunity there, but it wasn't there isn't a ton of them, right? So a lot of them are kind of in need. There's larger companies that are now looking at those type of services, so they are going to try and customize offerings and look at what they can give to people where there was a missing capability rather than replacement, right? Where it's kind of going into newer ones. So I found that pretty interesting, because we know that there's a lot more interest in PO and especially ASO services than we have ever seen, I think. And
PO is generally for smaller organizations. We usually don't see that go above maybe 200 to 400 employees. We have seen a few that go up larger, but usually that's with sort of breakoffs and small versions and different things that are kind of unique. But ASO, definitely in the mid-market, we're seeing more interest in managing some level of services, right? That allows you to be more strategic. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's something they could eventually grow but they would have to, I think, have services that were tailored for the mid-market. But I'm excited to see this. We did see a lot of announcements of people who are now taking on new roles in Paychex who were part of Paycor. So that's good to see some of the people that we have been watching to see sort of how will that consolidation happen, Cliff. I'm glad you were able to attend that. I know this is one of those areas where I think there wasn't a ton of overlap probably here, right? Like this is definitely a market where, we're seeing sort of an organization that focused most heavily on SMB now picking up an organization that kind of was in that higher SMB to lower mid-market, right? And going up because Paycor had been trying to move up market, now having the resources to move up more up market. So I think, it was an all cash acquisition, 100% of Paycor for, that $22.50 a share, which is a pretty big number. And I expect that we're going to see some heavy investments in sales here. That would be my thing that I don't know if that's what Tom and them mentioned or not, but that's would be my expectation, right?
Absolutely. And we know that they're a company that prides themselves on research. They do what they need to do and make data-based decisions. And so that is how they're looking at it, just purely like that. So yes, absolutely, they're going to be making that investment. We're also seeing, speaking of investments, this one is pretty interesting for a few different reasons. One is we don't know the name of it yet, but there's a new company launched by the Adecco Group that will work on the Salesforce platform. In fact, it'll work directly with Agentforce, which is Salesforce's digital worker allocation system. And so what they're looking to do is to integrate digital workers, AI agents, let's just say, and human workers into a solid sort of integrated workforce view and deployment center. This is interesting because we have talked prior to this story about other efforts that were made, probably, as you were saying before, Stacey, probably a little too soon, right? This seems to be more in line with the times. People are coming more to more understanding of the use of AI agents and not just it's a replacement for a person, which will be a theme I'm feeling as we go through this week's episode. But this is pretty interesting. So again, we don't know the name of it, but it does show that people are starting to make a kind of more realistic view of how AI can be used in companies rather than just saying, it's replacing a person, right? Instead, it's like, these are tasks and these are AI agents that are going to be responsible for certain types of work, and how do we integrate that with the workers that we have on the human side, right? So.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of terms used for this: digital workforce management. We're hearing, agentic workforce management. You're hearing total employees of record, right? It depends on sort of, I think, how you want to look at this, but it's definitely an ongoing conversation. What's interesting with Salesforce is they have a really strong partnership with Workday as well. So I'm wondering how that plus this Adecco is going to kind of combine out a little bit, right? But I do think that we are going to really start to see a conversation in the market about, do we treat agents like we treat employees? I have my opinion, but I do think the market is having that conversation right now. I think, that how you handle that inside your company and how you handle that inside of your business and how you handle that as a marketing conversation is definitely going to entail how your brand goes in the next couple of years, right?
Absolutely. So this one's pretty interesting. Maybe I find it interesting just because I used to work there, but I4CP, speaking of, I guess, brand, but they've actually gotten more investment and they're looking to grow quite a bit. So MC Partners out of Boston are the ones that have increased this. And as part of that effort, Kevin Oakes will step down as CEO and will be involved in other types of leadership. And Terry Waters will take over, who spent a lot of time at Gartner, but also was CEO at Avanta and Yankee Group before that. So basically with other types of analyst firms, Terry Waters will be taking over there. So that's pretty interesting. When I worked at I4CP, and Kevin Oakes was the CEO at that time. Good friend. So very, very cool to hear. They've been around. They tend to work more with practitioners. So it's always interesting to see some of their perspective. And they come out of the sort of academic world, actually, out of the college down here in St. Petersburg. So kind of interesting little connection.
Yeah, it's good to always see, I think, where some of that is heading. Terry Waters experience isn't just with sort of Gartner's, with the corporate executive board over there, which is CEB, which was another one that was acquired by Gartner that became sort of a consulting arm to Gartner to some extent, right? We're seeing more. I mean, I do think that organizations are looking for good data to make good decisions,
Yes.
right? And whether that's on performance or whether that's on benchmarking or whether that's on outcomes, I do think the challenge sometimes with benchmarking HR data and performance data is where do we get that data from, right? Is it survey data? Does that need to be financial metrics? Does that need to be vendor data? It's a hard conversation. We have it every day, right? Like, 'cause we do a mixture of both sort of what you're doing and a little bit about outcomes, and a lot of focus on what achieves those outcomes. So I'm excited to see where I4CP takes this with some of the investment. I'm not sure what this firm plans to do with it and where they plan to take it. They didn't put a whole lot of detail on that, other than just saying that they're going to help it grow. So I think that's a positive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, showing that obviously the market sees a need for, as you said, good data, and organizations can help other companies succeed, right? That's kind of a cool space to be in. And I'm not just saying that because that's what we do. But one that's pretty interesting, because I know we've been talking about global expansion as you talk about Workday. So this is pretty neat. Benefex is going to launch the name of the platform is My Benefits Hub, right?
Yeah.
So Benefex will be launching that platform, the My Benefits Hub, in Mexico, Costa Rica, and Peru. So into the Spanish-speaking countries, some of the biggest ones in Latin America, all of which I've been to. So that's really neat. Love all those countries. Nothing but good things. So that's really neat to see. We are also looking with our survey data, tying it all in, to expand more, get more information from there. So, bienvenidos to any of our Spanish-speaking listeners. We'll try and pepper in some more of my terrible Spanish throughout this.
We'll see if that goes over well or not, Cliff. I might
see you.
But I do think this international growth. We talk a lot about Europe and APAC, but the South America regions in general, particularly, right? Like the Americas overall, right? Is such a huge market, and I think it has not gotten as much attention. That's why I really liked seeing this from My Benefits Hub and Benefex coming together, because I think there is an opportunity to have a lot of conversation about how we expand globally around all the nations, right?
Yeah. Benefits is a weird one, right? Because it's so different in America than it is from others. So getting to see that kind of go out really shows a lot of, innovation, but also some bravery, right, of going into regions where it can be very, very different, right? And trying new, it's not just as simple as a translation. These are completely
benefits and payroll globally. We're going to have another story later on here with Chris Bruce, who's doing a focus on that. So but I think that's where Helios is at, right? Helios announced their strategic platform integration with Coda to expand benefit access for customers. So that's kind of how we're definitely seeing this focus on it, right?
Yeah, and that's interesting too, right? Because Coda is more of the financial side, right? Some of the fintech, but doing things that are, your insurance, but also, 401k or other types of retirement plans, pensions, and life insurance. So pretty interesting to see all of that integrated. We've talked about that a couple times of how these types of platforms are really, when they're done right, it can be a very powerful integration, right? It's a term that gets used probably too much is seamless, but that is what you're looking for from the end user side, especially around something like insurance, right? You want to make sure that it's as simple as possible. I was about to say painless, but when you're dealing with health insurance, that's maybe not the right word to use.
Any insurance, it's hard to use that, right? But I think the other part of that, Cliff, that's really important is that we are meeting employees where they are at, right? That we are thinking of benefits that make the most sense in the regions and in the areas where we're at, and that we think about benefits much more broadly than maybe here in the States. It's so overwhelmed with health, but there's so many other conversations about benefits outside the U.S. that are just as important, right? Stipends for housing, stipends for elder care and family care. There's really important conversations about, like you said, retirement or mental health support, those kind of things that may not fall under government funding. So it's a powerful conversation to have in any region that you have employees. And I think it is one of the largest expenses, at least globally, and definitely here in the US, but really globally, is the investment in benefits and whether or not they're being used inside organizations, right?
Absolutely. And you mentioned the Chris Bruce story. He just launched Origin, which this is a little surprising. So it's going to be a global benefits intelligence platform. And it's being powered by, I think I'm pronouncing this right, Cuido, Cuido, which will be a sort of AI benefits system, right? It's collecting all of that information, as you mentioned before. Part of it is taking all that documentation in and collecting it, organizing it, making sure that all the access rules are right. What I was saying was surprising is that Origin is trademarked, but I'm, of a certain nerdiness that I immediately think of Origin Systems, which are video game designers. I was like, wait, Origin's not trademarked as a software company? Interesting. So,
you have word systems, it changes it all. But it's important to note that Chris Bruce was also one of the founders of Thomson International, which was the international benefits platform picked up by Mercer several years ago. And he was for many, many years in contract with them and sort of finishing out that. So I'm interested to see how this differs from what he had. And at that point in time, it was a platform that just sort of aggregated information, right? Made it more feasible. And I think it's turned into a lot more services, which is part of what Mercer offers in that space. So I'm interested to see how this will translate differently, especially with the AI conversation here. So we're going to get a briefing from Chris and we'll get some more update on it. Yeah.
Wonderful. And yes, as we continue this sort of dive into the melding of sort of your day-to-day productivity tech and HR, we go directly to maybe the most well-known company in terms of work tech, which is Microsoft, who are mentioning they have announced general availability of people skills, both capitalized, not just a concept of people skills, but a platform called People Skills that will be kind of, I think it was skills in Viva, but it's going to be across 365, Copilot, and still in Viva as well. So it will kind of bring in all those capabilities along with the skills platform that they're going to continue to expand and elevate. So, again, taking the world of AI, taking all of those tools and using that for, all the things that go along with skills in terms of organization and availability and taxonomies and all that fun stuff that we all know and love.
Yeah, this one is interesting because I clearly remember a conversation with Patrick back in the day about, we're not going to compete with the skills space that, Workday and Cornerstone and all of them are into. And now, granted, they had skills in Viva, but it was much more about development, right? Like tying to the learning environment that was in Viva. This very much sounds like a skills agent. We'll get more details on it, but that is going to connect and start to help you understand how to develop teams based on skills and how to tackle projects based on skills, which very much leans into the skills work that we see happening in the HR platforms right now. So I do think that this is going to be direct competition. Now, what they may be saying, and we'll see as we get a little bit deeper in here, is that they may not have the ability, which I don't think they do, to set up that taxonomy, to set up that environment. It might be just like we're pulling skills from sort of the broader conversation. That might be where they're thinking that they can kind of skid by with we're still partners in this space. And you always need more when it comes to skills. Like no matter what tools you're using, there's never enough to really help you build out. But that is a really interesting conversation to be had. It's available starting in June, so just coming around the corner. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because I know already we turned on Microsoft Copilot finally a few months ago for me individually. I think we've had it for a while for our company. I'm already finding I'm struggling a little bit with Microsoft's Copilot, that it just keeps popping up in places I don't need it, or that it's offering things when I'm busy, and it feels a little clippy already. For those of you who remember the clippy days, I'm a little worried, you get more of this involved in it, and the more places where it can kind of feel like it's trying to add value, but it's not giving the agency in that. And we'll see where that goes, right?
No, absolutely. And it's interesting because we're kind of been talking about, AI in benefits and AI in skills. And now we've got, and I don't want to sound like it's negative, I just find it interesting. Salary.com unveils AI in compensation. Pretty interesting because this one makes sense to me, right? And they're very upfront about, we're using large language models, not just the short generic term AI. It's nice when you kind of see what's going on. The idea being here is that the kind of questions you would ask often were very complex, and it wasn't as simple as sometimes as, when I've done sort of external comp, right? Where I'm going, okay, how much does this job pay? And instead it's like, what is, the rate of people who accept jobs under this pay range that are within 20 miles of this city versus if I'm going to hire for someone else, but that's the type of thing where you can ask it those type of questions and be able to get answers to, what would normally kind of be a combination of reports. That's, I think, something where it makes total sense to sort of make that application of AI, right? Of getting sort of real-time answers to complex questions involving, a bunch of math, but stuff that's very important.
Yeah, but LLMs aren't always great with math, but what they are great with is human understanding, bringing together disparate sorts of ideas and creating sort of a more context of story that's a better there. I think in this particular case for salary.com, they've got a lot of the math already built into their environment. My sense is it's probably surfacing that story, that question in natural language processing that you would ask, and you need it before. It would have been surfacing sort of math, and now it's surfacing a story to go with the math. That's my take on it. And I could be wrong in that, but from what I'm hearing, from what they're writing, and from what I've seen in some of these, it's very similar to what we saw with V and Vizier, and very similar to what we're seeing with some of the agents that I think Workday is working on, and some of the agents we saw with I Am Phenom, right? Which is this idea that they're helping create a story around the math instead of the LLMs doing the math, because the LLMs don't always do the math as well.
Right. That's a good point.
The difference between that the very directive data set and algorithms that we've been building for years that are AI, right? And what is now this sort of probabilistic, as they call it, right? AI models, right?
Yeah, you get that data, and then you are the one that makes the decision or figures out what it means. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that. I know that it's something we talk about a lot, but I think it's very important to make those distinctions, because really we should be thinking about how can these tools be used, not, figure out where. It's not necessary. We're definitely going to do this. It's more about, do we need it, and where do we need it? But speaking of who's needed and where, that's my segue. We're going to talk about some of the people moves. So very cool. We're going to, no particular order on this, but Greenhouse has a new chief people officer, Paris, or possibly Paris Parker. Please let me know if I mispronounce your name. But, pretty cool. Someone who's done quite a bit in sort of the practitioner space, working at Kroger and Macy's, both sort of grocery and retail. If you're not familiar, I think you probably know Macy's, but I think Kroger is a regional. But yeah, so very cool. And also had worked at Paycor, speaking
I was
of.
going to say, most recently she came from Paycor as the chief human resource officer. So she's been in this space. So I was pleasantly surprised to see Greenhouse pick up a new chief people officer who's got background both in Paycor. But I do like the Kroger and the Macy's. So I come from, as you guys know, a retail background when I was a practitioner, and Kroger's and Macy's, a lot of retail in the Ohio space where I worked at, right? And they were some of the most forward thinking sometimes, right? At least that area was in HR early on. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what she brings to the table from both her practitioner experience in sort of the retail space, but also from her many years here, almost 3 years over at Paycor. It is interesting to see these shifts taking place. I'll be excited to hear more about what Greenhouse is doing here, right?
Yeah. And then another type of CPO, a chief partner officer. We've got a new one at UKG, Jay Detling. Well, I should say a new one. They never had a chief partner officer, but now they do. So another acronym to remember. But that's pretty neat. It kind of goes back to this idea of, that cluster, right? As we're thinking more and more strategically about which sort of systems work best in the ecosystem, that's sort of become such an important conversation that there's now executive level positions for determining who makes the most sense to work with and who to complete that, full suite of capabilities that you might need.
Yeah, this one, he reports directly up to Rachel Barger, who's a go-to-market. And what I really thought, like you said, the idea of expanding the idea of what a partner is inside of an environment is really big. Ultimate always had, before they joined the broader UKG group, really had probably one of the most innovative approaches to partnerships that I had seen. Now, they did have the traditional SI and implementer partnerships, but they were also one of those few who really broadened that idea of technical partners and broadened that idea of sort of influencers and people who were in that partner model, right? So it was an interesting perspective to see them now, I think, take this on a much broader scale UKG also, it had implementers, right? But they were not traditionally, up until just the last couple of years, one of the big implementer partners. So the Deloitte, Accentures, and they've been growing that pretty rapidly over the last couple of years, which means you have to have practices in those areas, which those partners have to feel there's some real value proposition in doing implementations and selections that lead to them. So I think this is going to really broaden that conversation. One of the things we do know about all these companies trying to go international, partnerships are much bigger and much more of a necessity for international based companies, those who are headquartered outside the US, because they have a lot more in the services and the support that we see for international companies. And so I do think that that's a big part of both of these large companies are all moving globally. They definitely have to hone in on their partnership conversation. So very interesting to see this. Now, what's nice is that Ling has a background at Accenture.
At Accenture, I was about to say when you mentioned that.
Yeah, but he also at Adobe, it looks like, which I think is an interesting one, and a couple of other big names. So again, we're seeing that broadening of the idea of what is a partner, right?
Yeah, Adobe, in fact, he was VP of Worldwide Partnerships and Alliances. So clearly that is the thought in that hire. So we've got another another executive officer, a chief marketing officer at Docebo. Kyle Lacey is joining. This is going to be hard to say, previously at Lessonly. So there's a lot of adverbs. But I found this one interesting, right? Because this is a chief marketing officer. This is, a person whose job is to do marketing. And during his sort of initial post, as he was saying, he said, and I'm kind of quoting him out of context, but it's very interesting. He said, "We're not here to slap AI on top of old problems." You love it. It does show that he's kind of thinking of this sentiment that people are starting to think about AI as like, look, don't come to us and just say AI is going to fix the problems. He's here, no, we're using AI, but we're not just trying to paper over the problems. This is not what we're doing. And so that's kind of interesting that a marketing officer is kind of coming out and saying, look, we're not going to push it. It's not just AI. That's not what we're doing. It's all about the processes and the people too. So
yeah, and Docebo. Sorry about that, guys.
For our Italian friends, we're not, Spanish is our thing.
Exactly. But, they were number one in our mid-market learning phase, right? We don't do a lot. One of the things we've actually working on is getting a briefing with Docebo and getting some more insight into sort of their direction and where they're heading. But I really do think that, there's only a few big names left in the learning space, right? Docebo is definitely one of them. And it's powerful to see them start to sort of rethink sort of who their leadership is, how they're pushing forward. I think this market is ripe for some change on the learning side right now. And so I was excited to see this. It'll be good to see where they're heading with this. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation here on the learning space, right? It's being impacted heavily by AI, right?
Absolutely. We've got more. Darwinbox has a new HR technology leader as SVP of North American Sales. So this is Sudi Bjornsted Korba going to Darwinbox. Another one that we're speaking with. So we'll find out a little more about sort of where they're going as they continue to expand. We know that the U.S. is very important and somewhere they're looking to do. And I think that's going to be a big focus for Korba as well.
Yeah, that was the big takeaway for me from this one, is that they are really pushing hard on the U.S. market. And Darwinbox has traditionally been more of an APAC enterprise HR platform. They've done quite well in the Asia Pacific market. We see them coming in a lot of write-ins, but I know they're really trying to make a space in the U.S. market. They have a more fresh platform. I guess the market would probably say, based off of what we're seeing in our data sets from a user experience perspective, it's a really competitive space in the mid-market, which is kind of where they're playing right now. So it'll be interesting to see. So definitely going to need someone very focused on North America. Yeah,
absolutely. And now a North American company, Perceptyx, has a new CEO, Ross Wainwright, replacing John Borland. John Borland's going to stay on, though, as a board member and help support the growth of Perceptyx. Perceptyx themselves continues to sort of expand. When I first started, I think when both of us first started covering them, we thought, employee listening, but they're getting more and more into data-driven insights, employee engagement, and culture. And a big part of this move, according to both John and Ross, is more of a focus on using AI to bring in all of that information. Kind of what you were saying before, Stacey, about the challenge is kind of collecting all of this data and giving it in a way that allows the person to kind of see what's happening and to make decisions rather than just being a pure numbers game is where they're moving sort of Perceptyx towards strategically. So John Borland, who's stepping down or stepping onto the board, I should say, I believe was one of the founders of it too. So
I didn't realize they had founded back in 2003. I thought they were more 2010, 2007, right? So 2003 goes, I didn't, so they've, and back then they were doing a lot more, I think, surveying, which was the employee surveying, but surveying, right? So they have definitely changed a bit over the years, but they're still one of the top brands that we see in our research right now, right?
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah, for a while they sort of occupied that space somewhat alone in terms of employee listening, but it makes sort of natural sense to have that, as becoming a more data-fied discipline in HR, right? To say, okay, well, let's take all of this sort of somewhat unstructured data to a certain extent and glean more insights and use that to drive more strategic direction from the company.
Yeah, and Wainwright's background really leads to this, right? CEO of Americas for Dimensions Data NTT, which I did a bit of work on. NTT was a friend of mine used to work there, and we I think had them listed as one of our emerging tech companies that people should be paying attention to for benchmarking data. They did a lot of the work around like weather related data and stuff like that, which was powerful in workforce planning. And then he spent 15 years in executive leadership role at SAP, including the EVP for Chief Customer Officer for S/4HANA Cloud. So again, we're seeing I do want to just note that we're seeing a lot of previous SAP leaders sort of making their way into the market. One, I think we should probably watch this carefully. One, they have a lot more global experience than we see in some other backgrounds in history. So one, I think that's one of the reasons from an HR perspective why you're probably seeing them take on senior leadership roles in a lot of organizations. I think two, we are seeing that a lot of organizations are needing to think more broadly about their data architecture, right? Which is a very engineering conversation, which is very, very SAP conversation. So that's kind of an interesting take, but lots of I think, opportunity here for Perceptyx to continue to sort of take a leadership role here, right?
Yep. And the final person move I want to talk about is Nicole Helmer and Nag Chandrakishar, both at Degreed. Nicole will be the CPO and Chief Product Officer, not Partner Officer, right? And Nag will be the Chief Solutions Officer. So you want to mention SAP? I believe that's Nicole was 7 years at SAP, right? But actually sort of as a practitioner in charge of learning and development rather than the product side. And again, that having that practitioner experience, I think is awesome for someone going into product development.
Yeah, this one I thought was, and one, I mean, Degreed has had a bit of a bumpy road, I think, as we've been investing in, as other systems have been picking up LXPs and front-facing platforms for learning. I think Degreed's been holding the line and trying to figure out sort of where they fit in the skills world. I think I have seen some good shifts for them, rethinking their strategy. I'm excited to see that they brought in a new chief product officer, someone who's got learning experience and background, who's led big global companies in learning like SAP. And then, I think also putting in a new solutions lead is another really powerful conversation, because one thing we know about HR technology is that it isn't just about putting the tech in, it's about what you solution around it that makes a big difference. And so I see them making some good moves here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's
my gosh, that was like 7 new people with new different roles, right? We do a couple usually, like that was a lot to cover. Like there's a lot of new people and new roles this last month, right?
Yeah, it was. And I know if you're listening, you were like, come on, get to the T. Well, here we go. I will tell you, listener, viewers, there was some discussion. Do we really want to cover this? Because it's a lot. But of course, right? We've already been talking about it. The rippling deal drama, right? If we're going to be called spilling the tea, then we got to talk tea, right? Got to talk drama. So the newest, if you haven't been keeping up, bless you. Also, the newest one is that Rippling wants Revolut, who's a payments fintech company out of the UK. They want them to kind of give them the info on who was paying the alleged spy within Rippling. If you recall, what's going down lately between the two of them is that there's been an allegation from Rippling that Deal had engaged in corporate espionage by having a spy who was leaking information back to Deal. Right, and that payment that they received, which was apparently $6,000 a month, which I'm not going to say like I'm not sitting here. You can see my background. I'm not in the gold plated mansion, but it just doesn't seem like that much money considering the stakes and how much is going on. That kind of threw me off a little bit. But either way, the wheel keeps turning in this story. I don't even know what's going to happen next. This is true popcorn GIF eating time. Right? Just like, let's see what goes on next. I mean, we can't really comment too much because there's a whole lot of allegations and who knows what. But it's, I think, to me, something that I've been talking a lot about, when speaking, is that this does signal a sort of shift in the industry. HR tech, and we've been talking so much about partnerships and ecosystems and clustering. It's traditionally been a very co-opetition-heavy space, meaning a whole lot of companies who are kind of going after the same customers but are more than willing to work together. This may be getting a move away from that because traditionally tech does not do that, right? They traditionally, you think of other types of tech, they create these walled gardens, right? Everything's really nice when you stay within the space. You cannot go outside of it. So yeah, I worry that this may trend towards that. It'll be interesting. And I'd love to hear from you, listeners, what you think about this. Is this just too much? Is it just watching from the background? Are you customers of one of these? What do you think about this? You mentioned brand earlier. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, this is it's a brand conversation for both of them, right? But I also think that it's also a bit of a microcosm of what I think we're getting ready to see in regulations and laws, right? Like one of the big things here is where a lot of this is taken down is in EU, and EU has very, very strict privacy laws, but it does sound like they might be able to get access to this Revolut payment area and who is the person actually doing that payment, because of some of the legalities and some of the lines they cross, right? And so I do think one of the things we've got to think about as we are buyers and practitioners and people speaking in this market is do we understand data privacy of not just our data and our employees' data, but of the businesses we're sort of signing in to partner with, right? This has always been the conversation about cloud technology, but you do want to have that conversation about like what's your security? What's your process? What's your approach? If I'm using payment tools, what is their security? What's their process? But at what point can someone get access to that information? It's a real question, right? The other side of this, I think that's important for us all. I do think you are right. And I do think maybe deal and rippling conversation here is also a sign of what might come when the market gets this competitive and the economy continues to stay down, which is where we're at right now. Now things could change, but right now we know economically we're looking at a continued down market both here and globally because of all the things that are happening. Then people start to the idea that all
rising
all
tide
boats rise right at the same point. If we all just go up, tends to go away pretty quickly because now you're fighting for the smaller market share and smaller audiences. And we did see this. I mentioned this last time. We've seen this in the past. We were going to see it again. It is a competitive market. When it becomes competitive, you have to figure out how you compete. I think every company's going to take their own approach to this. I just always caution everyone, make sure that your brand stays above the fray, right? That's the really important conversation because you want to make sure that you can stand behind what you're doing and what's happening in your organization and make sure, you're crossing all the legal dots, T's and I's, because HR is not a place where you can have any kind of concern about what people have access to or what might happen to a company, right? That you have your payroll running through. So as we've known, there have been times where payroll companies have gone out of business overnight and people have not been able to get employees paid because of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as long as we're spilling the tea, another sort of story that, I don't know if negative undertones or what, but definitely prompted a lot of conversation was a leaked internal memo from the CEO of Shopify that was very kind of pro AI, but in a way that I think turned a lot of people against sentiment wise. Where he was saying, you must use AI. If you're going to try and increase headcount, think of AI first, and prove that you can't just get this done without without AI, and that AI should be a part of any sort of build and, expectation of everyone. I think it was the exact words, a fundamental expectation of everyone.
Yeah, I think the exact language is hire an AI before you hire a human, which kind of threw everybody, right, Cliff?
Yeah. But it's interesting, right? Because it does show sort of the flip side to what we were showing or talking about before, right? Is our AI agents part of the workforce, and can that can be done in a lot of different ways, and how you frame that, how you sort of fundamentally approach that issue, because that is the case. But when you sort of make it a competition, right, instead of cooperation, that framing it's not gonna work. I'll just say that right out. People are not going to take that well, and it's probably not a good move for you if you are in a leadership position or you're thinking about ways, what do I do about this AI? Certainly don't set it up as an if or then, right? Instead of, it's like, here is how we can help by using these tools, help you, not how can we, replace you.
Yeah. I mean, and that is the crux of this, right? This started off with early conversations with Lattice trying to do employee IDs for agents back about a year and a half ago, right? There have been some pushbacks on what Workday is doing with their agentic platform, but I think they're taking a very much a people first approach to that conversation. But I still think it's going to be a concerning part for buyers. I think any place where we're positioning humans against AI, as you said, right? That's where you're going to lose out, because what you're going to end up with, and what we've already seen in our data set, is you're going to end up in a situation where people step back. People will step back and stop auditing, stop checking, stop pushing, because their whole company persona is AI first. And that's going to be the situation we have when something really breaks and there's no human aware of what's happening. And that's what we have to be. I think AI is going to do amazing things in the market. I am not telling people not to do AI. What I'm saying is be very careful that you don't make your workforce feel like that agent is not just replacing them, but they don't need to oversee it. They don't need to manage it. They don't need to be part of that conversation, right?
And this really leads into another sort of story that was making the rounds that we're going to talk about, which is that OpenAI had received even more funding, $20 billion. And people were sort of doing the math. You and I both read some long, very brain melting articles on trying to figure out how this would work. But it does this sort of, and we'll have all the links and you can go and kind of see what you think, because I agree. We've been talking this whole time about all these cool capabilities for AI, right? Ways of getting access to health insurance information and documentation and answering complex questions and things that, are much more easy now. But the other thing that goes on, we talk about just like, oh, maybe the employees will be upset. Another thing to think about in terms of why not to become too reliant or to think of it as a replacement is, what is it going to cost? Is it truly a good return on investment? Everyone's going, well, yeah, if I don't have to pay this AI agent as much, that price is going up. There's no chance. This is what the fundamental crux is. These AI systems, we started talking about this a couple of years ago, they are going to rise in price. No one's saying differently. Even the true believers saying, look, it's going to go up in price. It has to. It's a resource intensive tool. So if you are thinking, okay, this is long-term savings, you really need to anticipate very large cost increases of these AI tools, is basically what everyone's kind of getting at with this stuff.
Yeah, it's a challenge, I think, for all of us when we think about AI, that there's so much opportunity and we don't want to undermine the opportunity, but we do have to start putting financials behind this. I think there was a big conversation at the Workday conversation about total cost of ownership, values. It's got to show that there's value. You can't just say AI for the sake of AI. It does have to have a true value case to it, and one that will not just be a short-term efficiency, but will also be something that will show that you can maintain it cost effectively, right? You cannot underestimate that what you're getting now is a discounted rate for AI, and that you have to build in how much it will cost to maintain that technology. Everyone should be doing that in the conversation. And that's part of, I think at one point in time when we were talking early days about internet access, there was a Well, the internet will always be fairly inexpensive and access. And we have this conversation that today, one of the big challenges for the AI companies is how much just pure space they have to run these machine learning environments on, and how much it's costing to run that. Even large companies like SAP, Workday, and Oracle are having those conversations right now. So just always assuming that the space will be there or the speed will be there is something we've just got to be very aware of, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, all about that planning. So we could continue the AI conversation if you like. I did want to mention a couple announcements. Speaking of AI, I didn't want to flip-flop and give anyone whiplash, but just that Vizier had a couple. This probably should have gone earlier, but you can blame me for that one. But Vizier making more sort of AI expansion, right? That which you had actually brought up earlier, that's their AI digital assistant, V as a VEE, will be available on Microsoft Copilot. Speaking of that sort of integration. So, and then also they're going to be expanding their capabilities for workforce planning, which is pretty interesting considering we were talking about this in the last episode with Anaplan. Yeah. So you're seeing sort of areas outside of workforce planning, realizing there's a lot of useful information that could be part of that.
Yeah, the workforce planning, I cannot speak it up. And AI aside, workforce planning is all about running predictive analytics and running various scenarios and modeling. And what we're seeing come out of the market right now, which is not always AI driven, because AI doesn't do real well with accurate math and logistics like that. I think there are versions of AI that do better in that, the probabilistic or the predictive components of it. And I'm excited to see what we're coming out with workforce planning, because I do think we're starting to get to a point where workforce planning might be more than just a series of good HR questions. They're getting to be some standards in the market. And so that's what I think I would watch in that space is think about workforce planning more as a more standardized process than we ever have previously, right?
Yeah, very much using a lot of the supply chain logistics sort of language and processes. So kind of continuing on the AI, so one of the other stories that came out, this one was on like CNBC, was that all these sort of jobs being, all these fake job seekers. I saw all sorts of different versions of this story going on. And this is interesting because, our data has shown that one of the biggest uses for AI, actually, I think it's number one, right? How HR is going to use AI is in recruiting, right? Yeah. So again, as you're thinking about AI, I know we're giving you a whole lot to, consider, but, it should be a complex decision, and not just cost, but also what is the uses, and also how could it possibly be exploited or gamed, because we're seeing this whole, it's kind of interesting because I think we talked about a little bit about this before, is, there's AI sort of bots that are completely sort of spamming the systems, right? They're generating complete your photos, all that info, and applying for these jobs. But what's interesting is there's AI on the other side that's supposed to be filtering for solutions. So it's the two robots talking to each other. I know that that's kind of oversimplifying it, but it is pretty interesting to think about how we're using these tools and also how these tools are being used. I don't want to say against us, but sort of from the end user side as well.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that's happening here is that once these AI sort of profiles are hired, an imposter can install malware to demand ransom so it becomes a ransomware or cybersecurity issue, right? Because once you bring them into your system, they have access and they can be doing things, right? What I do think is an interesting conversation. We've got a really good microcosm of this in our data set, is that the survey more and more, there was a big article on how fake AI driven survey takers are happening in the market. So we always tell people, be very careful about who you're getting your survey data from. If they can't track that back to a human being or track that back to a person, and all you're getting is just data. And there was a whole story about a couple of the larger surveying companies who had basically been giving out data that was considered to be possibly driven by AI agents. And I know just for our fact, we have in our Qualtrics environment, they have a tool that AI will automatically tell you what they think is spam, and they give you like a 97% or 96% rating. We use that to call out some of the data we think is sort of being done by bots or being done by people who aren't relevant to the market set. But we also have Tammy, who is our data scientist, who does a hand analysis of a lot of that data too. And she does a periodic spot analysis. There's a process she goes through because there are some context situations where these AI agents are getting so good that they're filling in comments and they're randomizing the way they answer. And so you wouldn't really know unless you understand the content to know whether or not that data is inaccurate and to understand that maybe it's a bot filling it in and it's not a real human being. It's the same issue here on the recruiting side. On the flip side of that, as you noted, it's early days right now, but the number one ways that people were using AI over the last year was job profile creations. So we know AI was being used to update job profiles. We asked this year a question about what is the job role that is going to have the biggest impact from AI. Now, early, this could change, but we can already see in our data that outpacing every other role is the recruiter role is the number one role that's probably going to be impacted by AI inside of organizations. So if you're really kind of thinking through how all this is all happening, there is some risk factors coming out pretty quickly as to not having a human embedded in that process in a way that makes sense because of the AI on AI conversation here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely related to kind of another big story, which was, strangely enough, there's some jobs that just aren't being filled, right? And because they don't fit so nicely into sort of one of these platforms, categories, whatever you want to call it. I mean, this was big enough. It was in the Wall Street Journal. Yeah. And there was, they gave some wonderful examples, people sterilizing medical equipment, these sort of specialized skills. I actually think a lot about a friend of mine. Actually, it's the one who lives in Paris, and he is a product designer for medical device, for heart stents and stuff, right? And I've asked him, AI, and he kind of came through more of, I guess, a blue collar side, but that's the whole point, is that what he does can't really be replicated because it has so much to do with coordination of efforts. And it's not just the design, right? It's supplying and testing and all the things that go along with it. But he came through that starting like spooling wire for making the devices itself and having a hands-on understanding. But this is the idea, is that you notice I use the term blue collar, but that's the whole point, is that there's not such an easy distinction. There are these jobs that are high paying, highly skilled that can't really be achieved through any other methods, right? They can't replace this person.
They call them middle skill level. Like that's what the term they were using is middle skill level, and they are tech infused skill positions. They're not traditionally, they defy blue and white collar labels, right? They may require some college degree or some level of certification, but not the highest level like we see, right? So what I always tell people is that the jobs, there are amazing amounts of skilled labor that we do not have to fulfill these jobs in our data set, right? And this is where I think the market is we're letting AI run this show in some cases, and we are not. It doesn't have all the data. It does not have all the data. That's the biggest conversation there, right?
Absolutely. So I know this is a long one. We did say there would be a lot of stories.
We did, but we gotta find a wrap up point here, Cliff. Let's figure out how do we do it.
So let's talk a little bit. So we'll put some other ones in. There was definitely some interesting stuff, and I'll have the links there. But some trends in AI from Sloan School at MIT. One of the ones that I've kind of already mentioned is this idea about unstructured data and how important it is being able to sort of make use of basically types of data we didn't really consider before, which we've kind of talked about before, and how to get to that. And also some news from the US about funding that's going to be going towards AI training and apprenticeships and all that. Just, again, sort of this idea that I always have trouble sort of striking the right tone, because I don't sound, and Stacey, you said it earlier, it's not going away, right? AI is not going away. It may not be the rapid growth, and I don't want to say it's not a bubble, right? Because you think of a bubble bursting, it's more like a balloon that's going to deflate a little bit. We're going to find the exact right size for it. But so very interesting. But the one, aspect that you really nicely sort of segued us into is this intersection between AI and people. And we've been kind of talking broad strokes, but remember, this has a very real impact, and it's easy to forget too that different people are impacted by AI in different ways. We've kind of just been using broadly workers, but remember that almost all technologies affect different groups, especially marginalized groups, or different sort of separate, not the sort of people in power, in different ways. This has happened all across the board. It's not unfortunately, it is not that boat, the rising tide raising all boats, right? It's definitely affecting others. And this came to light really starkly from one of our good friends and colleagues, Jess Von Bank, on a post that she put out about the use of AI. And Stacey, I liked what you wrote back to her, and you just have wonderful thoughts on this. So take us away, because it feels a little weird to be talking about the impact AI has on women as a white male over here.
Yeah, I mean, Jess Von Bank has been creating a voice for herself in sort of women and AI and how we need to be part of the conversation as women leaders in the market, right? Which I'm wholeheartedly in front of. But what really caught me was that she had posted a podcast. I don't know if it was her podcast or it was another podcast, but in that podcast, she had recorded, was focused on gender gap, and she had hashtag AI, but then hashtag gender, hashtag inclusion, hashtag equity and bias, and that it was basically removed for compliance review, and not just on Spotify, but everywhere. And one that just, and she's like, I'm not going to repost this. We talked about eloquently, but it's just knowing that those words triggered a compliance review through her, and it throws me because yes, I get it. We're in a market right now where these conversations are hard to have because we have legislation and governance and senior leaders who don't want to have those conversations. Literally, they just don't want to have those conversations. But we have to understand that data is data. And part of what Jess was really pointing out was that there are just some data about that women use AI less than men, that AI will have disproportionate impact on women because they are overrepresented in roles that are susceptible to automation. We know this, right? Administrative roles. There are more women managers, and it is middle managers that are going to be heavily impacted by AI investment. We know that AI is going to have a huge impact on HR. 70% of AI professionals in the HR space are female leaders. If we move up to organizations over 5,000 employees, we'd see the HR leadership drop to 60% being female, 40% being male. And as you move up to Fortune 100, that gets to more 50-50 and even 40-60. So we do know that there are huge roles that are going to be impacted and differences are going to be happening. And we cannot run away from data. That is the number one thing that I say over and over again, that data is a data point that helps us understand the context of what's happening in the market. And so my call out to all of my podcast friends was, let's see how many of us can get reviewed for compliance. And by just talking about the reality that if I am a female and AI is being designed by someone who has not lived my personal experience, can they actually understand the biases that might be impacting, because they're not living that environment. They don't understand what it's like to work in an environment where maybe there's just not enough bathrooms for females, or there's not enough opportunities because there's 70% female and 30% men. Do we not have enough opportunities for men to move up in a different position? It's just data, and we've got to have that conversation. And so I'm just a big proponent of we should not be having conversations like equity and bias and gender being call outs for compliance in our conversations. And so that's my 2 cents on it. I know that there are people who can speak more eloquently than me, but I wanted to close up our conversation today on that.
No, it's wonderful. And that's exactly what we should be doing, is having these conversations. They might be difficult, but if we don't have them, it's not going to get better.
It's not. Well, Cliff, we've had there's a lot more that we could be talking about today. There's a lot of EU stuff going on. There's a lot of events coming up, but I know we've already gone way over our time today. But I do want to say, I just thank you all for being part of this. Every time Cliff and I sit down, we're like, what should we cut? What should we include? How should we have these conversations? It's really hard to say what we're not going to cover, to be honest. But we'd love to hear from you. Are we touching on the right things? But we do have to wrap for today, because I know it's been a long day. But as we wrap, just a couple of big things. Just to remember that the annual HR System Survey White Paper is still available. As we're getting ready to do the survey for the next one, please be sure to participate this year. Please be sure to make sure, if you need access to that data, you go to our website. We're also getting ready to launch a new research center for those of you who are kind of watching along with what we're doing there. Also, The May 1st public launch of the survey will go with a lot of hoopla about who's supporting it. So we do want to say thank you to all of our distributors and all of the people who participate. It makes this possible. Also, as we're wrapping, be sure to listen to our sister HR Huddle podcast, HR We Have a Problem, hosted by our CEO, Terry Zipper. These HR Huddle episodes are really important. If you like them, please subscribe and leave a message below. To stay up to date with immediate breaking HR tech news and to get all the behind the scenes content, you can follow us at Sapient Insights on LinkedIn and Instagram. And Cliff, thank you as always for helping pull all this together. I know it's hard to kind of coordinate which of these topics we're going to be covering and where. Thanks to our production team, Brand Method Media Group, who helps us produce our podcast, run by their amazing founder, Kelly. Our marketing team, Summer Orlano, Mark Bichetto, and Cole Harris for making sure that this gets put together and gets up on the site and gets loaded. Thank you to our listeners in our community. We couldn't do this without you. And that's it for this episode of Spilling the Tea in HR Tech. I'm going to go outside and enjoy a little bit of sunshine today. We hope it's been the best, just the brew you need to start the engines running this week. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with another pot of boiling hot HR Tech updates and insights. Bye, everyone.